Okay, good morning everyone and welcome everyone to our session on nuclear threats and international security. I'm So-Young Kim, Reuters Korea Bureau Chief. Nuclear security is a very topical issue at the moment, and in a few days at Davos, we are going to hear US President Donald Trump talking about North Korea and Iran, among other issues. The developments in North Korea over the past year have been alarming, with Trump and Kim Jong-un exchanging threats of a nuclear war. Only a few weeks ago, the two have been talking about who's got a bigger nuclear button. In Iran, after world powers spent years to negotiate a deal to curb Iran's nuclear program, that's facing an uncertain future, with Trump refusing to accept it as it is. We have an ongoing nuclear rivalry between India and Pakistan, and existing nuclear weapon states are modernizing their arsenal, led by the United States and Russia. And the upcoming nuclear posture review from Washington is expected to call for a greater role of nuclear weapons in US defense strategy. So it's a very great time to discuss this issue, and we've got a great panel for that today. Let me briefly introduce the speakers. To my left is Minister M.J. Akbar, Minister of State for External Affairs of India, and he's also an author of several books on India and Pakistan. We have Yuichi Funabashi, Chairman of Asia Pacific Initiative. He's one of Japan's leading commentators on foreign affairs. And we've got Beatrice Finn, Executive Director of the ICANN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. ICANN, as you know, received the Nobel Peace Prize last year, recognized for its work drawing attention to this very important issue and getting the UN General Assembly to adopt a nuclear prohibition treaty last year. So I'd like for us to take a step back for a moment and sort of examine why the issue of nuclear weapons and why the specter of a nuclear war is back on the table decades after the Cold War ended. Let me kick it off with Yuichi.
In answering to your question, why now all of a sudden, I'd like to offer a couple of comments. The first factor at play is fiery personalities involved in international politics, Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump are mutually unhinged. Donald Trump takes Nixon's madman theory to new heights. All his rhetoric and behavior are premised on being unpredictable. Making that situation over the Korean Peninsula full of suspenses. And this could lead to unpredictability, could lead to escalation. He seems to believe that this making everything unpredictable could elevate his leverage, increase his leverage. Deterrence leverage. But as Graham Allison has argued that during 13 days of Cuban crisis in 1962, there were more than a dozen of instances in which the miscommunication, misperceptions, misunderstanding between the United States and Soviet Union could have led to a nuclear war. So you must not underestimate this danger of unpredictability. Second factor is North Korea's psychology and ideology. North Korea now has seen a nuclear weapon as the ultimate deterrence. They have become convinced that nuclear weapons are necessary for their regime survival. We should remember that North Korea's nuclear program has preceded Donald Trump's much, much earlier, over the past half century, since 1960s. And after the Cold War ended, it accelerated. So by merely increasing the conventional weapons capability, North Korea just cannot match the power of South Korea, supported by the United States, South Korea's ally, and alliance networks in the Asia Pacific. So through that nuclear weapon, North Korea is trying to ensure the unification of the two Koreas, which means eventual dismantle of the United States military presence on the South Korea. Okay? And perhaps North Korea will attempt to weaken and neutralize the ROK-US alliance. And then it will likely attempt to engage that regional players in nuclear blackmail. So this is a really real, clear, present threat to the neighboring countries, particularly from Japanese perspectives. It had 2 North Korea's missiles flown over the archipelago just in the last year. Okay? One landed 370 kilometers from shore. Okay? So and North Korea actually made it very crystal clear to Japan that I quote, that it wants that 4 islands of Japanese archipelago should be sunken into the sea by that nuclear bomb of Chuche. Okay? It was an official comment in reaction to Japan's voting in United Nations Security Council sanctions resolution in September last year. Okay? So even though I think that we ought to aim for that nuclear abolition, a nuclear-free world, and we have very much lauded and commended that ICANN's activities, and also it's very encouraging to see that this nuclear ban abolition treaty. But it certainly we hope, and majority of the Japanese public also supports and encouraged to see that this makes conducive international environment for this to be realized. But at the same time, we must realize that we are confronted with that very clear present threat. Okay? So I don't think this is a mutually exclusive. Okay, the aspiration for eventual nuclear-free world, and the step-by-step, to treatment and of the addressing this nuclear threat from North Korea.
But but given that we have very present threats from North Korea, do you think there is a greater risk of a nuclear arms race in the region and globally? For example, in Japan, I think going nuclear still has been much of a taboo, but that hasn't stopped commentators in Washington from suggesting that perhaps Japan and also South Korea should consider going nuclear in order to counter North Korea. Do you think that gaining any momentum at all?
It seems to gain a little bit more currency in some circle in Washington. First, I think that it's more sort of tactical. The logic is to put pressure on China to act on North Korea by using Japan. Okay, so this is designed to address the nuclear threat from North Korea. Most recently, a very different kind of logic has emerged in my mind. It's more worrying to me. That is that the primary threat, perceived threat, comes from China. Okay? So geopolitical ambition of China would be contained by nuclearizing Japan and Korea, even Taiwan. Then the United States should withdraw the troops from South Korea, cut the defense budget, and then let America's allies pay the cost to contain China. This is much more strategic. Okay? It's still limited to fringes of the policy circle, but I think that we really have to be very, very careful of that. This option does not exist in Japan. Okay? This is not tenable, as you said.
Let me go to Minister Akbar and sort of hear the perspectives from a nuclear weapon state. Why do you think more countries are pursuing nuclear weapons, and what makes it so attractive for the countries, and why do you think it makes them feel safer?
Well, countries see nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrence. It's all a question of whether you are sending a missile or a message. That said, I can speak for my country's record, India's. Just a few days ago, we joined the Australia group. A little before that, we joined Wassenaar. As you are well aware, we had the NSG waiver when we did the nuclear deal with the United States. All this is evidence of what we know, and now the world recognizes that India is a very responsible nuclear state. I think almost every criteria that is required in order to define responsibility has been met by us. And met by us not because anyone asked us to do so, but met because we wanted to do so. Every year in the United Nations, in the first committee, we introduce 3 resolutions seeking a step-by-step approach towards reducing the dangers we recognize. Of course, everybody in his rational senses recognizes the dangers. But our approach is equally clear, that we would like a nuclear regime that is universal, that is non-discriminatory, and that is verifiable. And I think these parameters are acceptable to the world. And therefore, we get the support from various countries. We believe that this will be further augmented, hopefully, in the near future. And we also hope that the world will work towards reducing, if not eliminating, the dangers. On a separate level, on a question that you asked my friend here, one of the theories that has kept the world still free of nuclear war since the Second World War is a theory aptly, I suppose, described as MAD, mutually assured destruction. And the history of humankind says that people in power have been rarely worried about destruction, but everyone takes self-destruction seriously. So that said, we cannot at all ignore the need to work towards a world in which this threat leaves us or goes away as soon as possible.
When people are worried about the specter of a nuclear war, but also there are often fears cited by people of countries, having nuclear weapons make countries more maybe belligerent or providing the cover for more belligerent conventional action. And take India and Pakistan for example. Yes, nuclear weapons have not been used. There was no large-scale war, but we have continued clashes along the border. So what do you have to say to that?
We can only speak from our position. I can obviously cannot speak on behalf of another country. We as I have said, have these weapons as a form of deterrence. We believe that in no first use. We hope that this, in the process of a step-by-step approach, that we can get agreement from the world on no first use. It would be an important step forward in a process. I have always personally believed in a philosophy of governance wherein we must never sacrifice the good in search of the ideal. So if the ideal cannot be achieved as soon as we would all wish, at least we can work towards the good. And I think that really is a realistic option before the world. And one of the things I do want to say actually is, very often world affairs, it's easy to hear the noise. It's slightly less easy to hear the silence. And there has been a great deal of silence about proliferation. People with a track record of proliferation have been allowed to get away. And then suddenly, when you see an expansion of weaponization, we all pretend to look very startled.
So I'd like to ask Beatrice, Minister Akbar mentioned that India is a responsible nuclear state, and countries like United States also say that they are responsible nuclear states, but other countries with nuclear weapons, North Korea, for example, cannot be trusted. What's your view on that?
I think first we need to really look at what nuclear weapons are. These are the most inhumane, indiscriminate weapon that has ever been created. And the nuclear armed states don't usually like to talk about the weapons themselves. They like to put it into geopolitics, strategy, balance of power. But these are weapons that are meant to mass murder civilians, indiscriminately slaughter as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. If you use any use of nuclear weapons would immediately cause hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of casualties, depending on where it's used. It would burn and poison survivors. It will keep killing people decades after the weapon is being used. How responsible is that? And that is plans and preparations right now in all the nuclear armed states and the military allies of these states that are participating in that. They are planning and preparing for using these weapons on people. So I think it's really important to remember that when we talk about nuclear weapons, that these are inhumane, indiscriminate weapons. And of course, no one really wants to use nuclear weapons. Most nuclear armed states is just for deterrence. But if we look at deterrence, what it really means, having these about, 15,000 nuclear warheads still around, pointing at cities and people all over the world, if we don't get rid of them, they will be used. And this is not just fear-mongering. Statistically speaking, ask a mathematician, the risk is always greater than zero. Right now, it's quite high. We see an increased tension with an increased risk. But as long as they exist, if we keep these weapons forever, they will be used. I think that's really just important to make that kind of point, that they will be used and people will die. It can be a mistake. It can be an accident. It can be non-state actor attacks, cyber attacks. And I think that sort of this assumption that we have that some governments are rational actors, this is sort of a sane security policy, is really starting to fall apart today. We see 2 nuclear armed states that are threatening to use them. And with that also comes increased preparations from their military, increased nervousness. Just this last week, we saw what happened in Hawaii. That could have been it could have been, what if that alert had gone directly to Trump? What would his response would have been? What if the North Koreans would have thought, for example, that that was just an excuse to start an invasion and would have thought that maybe we better launch first? So I think that this kind of scenario that we have right now is really extremely problematic. And we see all the nuclear armed states going in the wrong direction. We have this new Trump policy that's going to come out, the nuclear posture review. that lowers the possibility of use of nuclear weapons. It develops new types of nuclear weapons, low yield. And just remember that by today's standard, the average size of today's nuclear weapons is much, much bigger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So if you look at the size today, Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs are considered low yield. And that would be more, the policy says that they will be more likely to use them then. Do we really need Trump with more, feel more able to use nuclear weapons? But we also see, for example, there was an Indian ICBM test last week. A responsible government practicing, testing its capability to slaughter civilians, wipe out entire cities. I think this is a very concerning trend. And I think that the only option we have, if we do not want nuclear weapons to be used, we have to get rid of them. I think that's just, we can't keep these weapons if we don't want them, if we don't want to deal with the consequences of their use. So of course the only option is to work to prohibit and eliminate them. And while we're seeing this very negative trend amongst nuclear armed states with increased threats and sort of trying to lower the threshold for using these weapons, we also see a very positive movement where the majority of states in the world are committing to have negotiated a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons and are committing legally to say we will never use, possess, or develop these weapons. And I think that's the pathway forward. These kind of course you can do step by step, like steps to reduce the risk, but as long as they exist, we will have to deal with the consequences of their use eventually. So it's very urgent that we move towards disarmament. And we have this framework right now with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that is the way forward.
One of the challenges is that we are in a situation where the established nuclear weapon states are not abolishing their weapons, and in fact they are modernizing it, making it better. At the same time, they are telling others not to develop. So it doesn't seem to imbue much trust or confidence in the minds of the prospective nuclear states. So I wonder what can the nuclear states do on their part to discourage proliferation and sort of give the trust to nuclear wannabes that this is not the path forward?
Well, I think you have to stop thinking that deterrence solves all your problems and argue that nuclear weapons are necessary for security. I mean, we see even countries in Europe, for example, today, that are part of the nuclear umbrella, through NATO, for example, that are arguing that we need to threaten to mass murder civilians in order to feel safe. If a country in Western Europe, for example, needs to have that as their security policy, how can we demand that North Korea isn't going to think the same way? Why do we put higher demands on humanitarian law in North Korea than Norway, for example? So I think it's just, we have to start looking at this. And if we believe in nuclear deterrence, if we think that nuclear weapons creates peace and stability, then why aren't we welcoming North Korea's nuclear weapons? Why aren't we saying that that improves the situation in the region? Because actually, it doesn't. I mean, I think that we see right now that this conflict, we're heading towards war in the region. And that is fueled by nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are creating the crisis rather than solving and preventing it.
Minister Akbar, could you respond to that?
The demands of security simply cannot be wished away. It's easy, and we all know what nuclear weapons can inflict. We have evidence from Japan. But as I said in the beginning, any step forward cannot be discriminatory. It has to be universal. You cannot take a position that a particular region's you cannot take a position that a particular region start acting unilaterally. We are in Europe. There are 3 European nuclear states. Why don't they lead the way?
What about India?
No, I'm sitting in Europe. We'll discuss India and Delhi. Why don't 3 European states lead the way? Obviously, they have governments which have an understanding of security. I don't know, I haven't seen any poll, but supposing we ask these 3 European countries to take an opinion poll on whether their people, the publics, would like unilateral disarmament or not. And what do you think the answer of the opinion polls will be? And the people know, of course, that they will pay the price. Now, I have said in the beginning, I said in the middle, and I say again, that we believe in a sense of responsibility, our duty, not only to our own people, but to the world. We work very strongly through the multilateral framework, particularly the United Nations. We introduce 3 resolutions every year, repeatedly, through the first committee. We urge other nations to take steps in a step-by-step approach, which is through the multilateral framework, which is the only way forward, right? And we hope that this diligence with which we work towards a safer world will get the response. In the meantime, we do also take the opportunity of reminding the world of the dangers of proliferation, of the need to act against proliferation. We question why there is no steps are taken against proliferation. And while the world is full of questions, maybe, as our friend says, there should be some answers too.
Yuichi, do you agree that the multilateral framework is the way to go to discourage proliferation?
When NPT was ratified in 1970s, there were 5 nuclear weapon states declared and recognized one. And certainly it was discriminatory, in a sense that it favored that those who already had nuclear weapons designated, I should say, as entitled to be a legitimate nuclear power, whereas the others, aspirants, are banned. So it's unfair, structurally. And the tally now is 9, right? So the effectiveness of this multilateral framework also is questionable. But at the same time, insofar as that there was no nuclear war over the past 40 years. Actually, it was effective, even though it's very much insufficient. So we have to realize that it is very much insufficient, incomplete arrangement, but it's not time for us to dismantle that. We have to, I think, repair it and strengthen it. And on that account, I think that President Obama was really right on the mark. In his Prague speech in 2009, he put the onus on the United States and the other nuclear weapon states to do more by reducing that nuclear weapon in national security strategy. Okay? So this was very new, actually. So I pin hope on that sanity of those nuclear weapon states. But at the same time, I think we also need that strong pressure from the public in the world to have them done that, to force them to live up to that aspiration. By the way, that concept of deterrence was enshrined, legitimatized in NPT regime. So it would be extremely difficult to expect this concept to be done away with.
I mean, both Yuichi and Minister mentioned that the countries, they see nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrence. So if you're North Korea or Iran or other countries, and if you think that having nuclear weapons is the only thing that guarantees your survival, how can they be persuaded otherwise, convinced otherwise, that actually it makes them less safe? Maybe Beatrice?
think it's impossible to convince them unless we address the problems of nuclear weapons. I think we cannot expect to prevent proliferation when some other states continue to argue that nuclear weapons are essential for security. If the United States, which is the biggest conventional military power, no one else can match them, if they need to threaten to indiscriminately slaughter civilians with weapons of mass destruction in order to feel safe, how are we going to be able to convince other countries? It's very much do as I say, not as I do kind of attitude, which I think is really, so we have to address, if we want to prevent proliferation, we're going to have to address nuclear weapons as a whole. It is not which country has them that is the problem, it's the weapon that is the problem. And I think we also have to look at then for all nuclear armed states and potential proliferators, really sort of what constitutes as a credible and effective defense today. Maybe nuclear weapons have actually makes us all less safe, not just because of the threat, but also because we are not focusing on perhaps proper defense. This is 1945's technology. It's not modern warfare weapon. The kind of warfare that happens today, it does not focus on leveling entire cities of civilians. We're not actually supposed to take out Moscow. Like that doesn't make any military sense in any kind of way today. So perhaps continuing to cling on to these outdated weapons of mass destruction actually prevents governments from thinking about what kind of defense is needed in the 21st century. And perhaps that is also a big security concern for these states. Maybe the military needs to think about what kind of security threats, climate change, terrorism, cyber attacks. You can't fight those things with weapons of mass destruction that spreads radiation for decades.
So, Jan, by the way, there have been a couple of instances of countries giving up on nuclear weapon. South Africa, Brazil, even Ukraine, Korea and Taiwan. So there are some cases in which that you can expect the countries to eschew, obviate that passion and impulse to develop nuclear weapons.
Can it be applied to today's situation by any chance?
As far as North Korea is concerned, it would be extremely difficult. Even if the United States and others would provide that security assurance, as we did in 2005, it didn't do much effect. So I think it's very good. But realistically speaking, it's very difficult.
And that's why increasingly people are discussing the possibility, whether the world just should live with a nuclear, the world, whether it has any option but to live with a nuclear North Korea. Do you think it's ever an option? And if that's the case, then would that do irreparable harm to non-proliferation efforts?
I don't know. We don't have any easy answer. Maybe over the long run, it will depends on that North Korea's regime change. That might lead to some peaceful evolution from within. That may be one of the scenarios, as exemplified South Africa. How realistic that the regime change of North Korea would be, I don't know. But North Korean people's income has increased saliently in the past several years. 75% of that income comes from the market. So the people gradually has become to be aspirational. If the people really are completely in that bottom, no hope for the future, they don't have any incentive to change. But if they start to acquire some aspirations, they want to change, that could lead to that regime change in the future. I'm too speculative here, I know that,
Thank you. I'm Radek Sikorski. I was Poland's defense and foreign minister. I'm glad the case of Ukraine was mentioned, because as you know, it's not a happy story. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in the framework of the Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia, the United States, and others guaranteed Ukraine's security and borders, and we know what happened. And that's not a very good lesson for those who would be persuaded to give up their weapons today.
I agree.
I would like to be nuked as much as you, which is to say, not at all. But when I was defense minister, I declassified Cold War era warfighting plans that were in our archives. We were the second army of the Warsaw Pact, including Soviet plans of invasion of Western Europe. And they showed that the Soviets were intending to use nuclear weapons from day one on a massive scale against Germany, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, but not France and the United Kingdom. You see, if you argue that nuclear deterrence doesn't work, you will not be persuasive, because it does. So you need to construct your argument differently. We have got huge reductions of strategic weapons. And what Norway and Poland have argued for several years now is that we need to do the same with respect to weapons that are completely unregulated today, which is the sub-strategic tactical level. And there are many more thousands of them. And those are the ones that are much more likely to be used than the big ones. So I would argue, I would agree with you that let's focus on what's achievable, because these weapons will not be disinvented.
Yeah. On both points, I think that the Ukraine thing is quite interesting, actually, but not perhaps for the same reason as you are implying. I think it would be naive to think that Ukraine could have kept their nuclear weapons and all would have been fine. That they would have been allowed to keep their nuclear weapons, that wouldn't have triggered a major conflict with Russia. We can have this hypothetical conversation of just placing nuclear weapons in Ukraine today and nothing would have happened. But we could have seen war, nuclear war, accidents, and the world could have looked completely different. So I think it's to just say that Ukraine could have kept nuclear weapons and they wouldn't have been invaded today is to discount what would actually have happened if Ukraine would have said to Russia, "Now we're not going to give them back." That would have, I think, gone a completely different way in history, and nothing we can predict really what would happen. I think, I'm not saying that nuclear deterrence might not work in certain cases, but you can't 100% guarantee that it will never lead to nuclear use. And you can never guarantee that there will never be an accident, a misunderstanding, a miscalculation. We've seen also war happening because of nuclear weapons. I mean, the war in Iraq, for example, was because of suspicions of weapons of mass destruction. We're seeing again calls for military conflict with Iran because of nuclear weapons. So it also triggers conflicts. And it doesn't prevent misunderstandings and accidents. And what are we going to do then? How safe are we going to be the day that it actually goes off, for example? And that's something that nuclear deterrence perhaps prevents something sometime. I mean, you can bury landmines in your garden and say that it's going to deter from burglary. It's not a good thing anyway. It's not going to keep us safe. So I think it's important to realize that. And of course, we would love to see progress on tactical weapons and things like that. We are not against these steps that needs to be taken. I think that's how nuclear weapon states need to move. But we cannot continue to cling on to that these weapons protect us and keep us safe, because then we'll never get to the goal that we all have subscribed to, a world without nuclear weapons.
Gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. very interesting panel on a very key subject. I'm Espen Barth Eide. I was Norway's defense and foreign minister, and hence a colleague of my good friend Radek Sikorski. But I was also foreign minister when Norway launched the humanitarian initiative, which was the start that led to what is now the ICANN Peace Prize in a sense. So I have a dilemma, and I have to be open about the dilemma, because I fundamentally agree with Beatrice Finn and ICANN's cause that the world has become way too dependent on nuclear weapons, and we have a shared responsibility in getting out of this. I also agree with Mr. Akbar and Radek that you can't do this from today to tomorrow. So you need to find a path. I don't think Beatrice is saying that either. You have to find a path out of that. And a very crucial element is exactly to, and here I agree with Radek, the first thing I would do is to make sure that we stop the production of usable weapons. Because I would actually prefer a world where we only have those that you can only use in such an extreme case that you won't actually use them, the old ICBMs, then Armageddon is loose. But the tactical bunker buster small weapons is the most dangerous weapon, because certainly this may be tempted to use it saying it's just a small thing. If they're used, the taboo is broken, and we're in a much, much more dangerous world. So that's a good start. But I also think that we who are either nuclear states or allied with nuclear states, we have to be more creative in thinking how we can contribute to create that transition that makes it possible. And one of them, of course, is to ensure that relevant deterrence can be achieved without resorting to nuclear weapons. It's also investment in conventional arms, that you have a much higher threshold, because you don't need to make the choice between being invaded and using nuclear weapons as easily as has been traditional. So my point is that we need, I was a little long, but I strongly support what ICANN wants to do. At the same time, I cannot recommend my own countries to sign the treaty today, but I very much want us to create that transitional circumstance that delegitimizes any actual use and eventually makes it obsolete. And my very final point is that current wars are not like 1945 or the Cold War. A number of the hawks of the old Cold War argue, really sort of the really right-wing hawks of the US and UK and other Western countries are saying they were useful, we're not convinced they are as useful any longer. So that's also an important part of the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Hide Uzaki. I'm a governor of Hiroshima Prefecture. And, first I'd like to say that to discuss about nuclear weapons, we need to recognize what the reality of the use of nuclear weapons. And so I recommend everyone visit Nagasaki or Hiroshima to see the reality of the use of nuclear weapons. And I think there are two very important issues. One is about deterrence that we've been discussing. And deterrence cannot be discussed as just deterrence, but we need to kind of go into details of deterrence, again, who and what, etc. And they're all different. The Indian situation, the US, Norway, Japan, they're all different, so we need to kind of scrutinize what the deterrence really is. And second issue is the step-by-step. I think there are no actions in the steps by the nuclear weapon states have triggered such dissatisfaction among non-nuclear states. And so it's, I think, now time for nuclear weapon states to seriously show what are the steps and what they are going to do with it. So in Hiroshima last year, we had a roundtable discussion among experts, and there were two recommendations, and one was about deterrence, and another was step by step. We had a recommendation for nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states who are under umbrella get together to discuss what the steps are really, and show the world they're going to take those steps. So I have a question to Minister Akbar. How do you, what would you say to that recommendation? Getting, nuclear weapon states getting together to discuss seriously about the steps, because it's too vague, at this point, but we need to see it seriously.
Sir, in the multilateral frameworks, after all, we are talking about a multilateral problem. In a multilateral framework, there are institutions, and the first committee is called first for a valid reason at the UN. And the very first step, indeed, has to be to talk. And talk, I think, in practical terms, in realistic terms, right? Deterrence is not that difficult to recognize. I won't say more, except suggest everybody looks at a map. So, but yes, all I'm trying to suggest, we are very proud of the fact that our objective is peace. Our objective is demilitarization of this. I'm glad some other issues have been raised here, which I might have not been so proactive in doing, but they are realistic. Some of the issues really of the nature of weapons, what can be done about first use, and so on. Now, there are very practical steps forward. And I hope that this process will germinate and become realistic. But I do want to say that we want peace, but peace doesn't come necessarily through pacifism.
So I'm a business school professor. I know very little about nuclear proliferation or its ending, but I have a few questions. I grew up in India, nuclear state. I live in the United States, another nuclear state. India could lead. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi did. India could unilaterally not develop nuclear weapons. So could the US. But I don't want to make a statement. Assume for a moment that a country uses a nuclear weapon. Assume also for a moment that you could not deter a suicide bomber. You could stop him or her. What will happen to the country that uses a nuclear weapon?
Minister?
You are on the spot.
Since we are a small nuclear state, the answer must lie elsewhere.
You're copying out. You're not answering the question. India is pretty good at copying out. I don't think we should cop out. This is a free, frank discussion.
India is also very good at not being provoked.
Oh, of course. So no one wants to answer?
I'll take the two questions from the gentleman and the lady.
Ken Choi from Joseon Daily Newspaper, Korea. Yoichi, you're a foremost expert on North Korean nuclear issues, and you wrote extensive 600 pages book about North Korean nuclear issues. And recently, New York Times reported that the U.S. military is preparing unwanted war that could happen in North Korea, meaning that President Trump might order bombing North Korea. I'm just wondering, what is the likelihood of actually that scenario would happen? And to Minister and Beatrice, Ms. Finn, what could be the international sort of coalition or efforts to sort of denuclearize, or at least pulling North Korea out of the pathway that it's going? Because right now it seems like North Korea is only trying to deal with the U.S. or South Korea, or whatever, and the international community is not really there. And even if there is a sort of a six-party talks, it's almost malfunction. It's not working what it's supposed to be doing. And I'm just wondering, we talked about all good things about how international community can come up with creative ideas to, sort of denuclearize, or at least pulling the world away from the possible nuclear war. But it seems like, there's no international community dealing with North Korean issues except the UN sanctions and stuff like that. So first, I want to ask Yoichi, and then the other questions to the other.
Well, Ken, thank you for your question, but I do not want to thank for your tough question because I cannot forecast, and I wouldn't but I can perhaps try to articulate what is politically impossible here. I think I can envision first, United States will have to factor that South Korean people's fear and determination not to get involved in war they cannot control. Okay? And I do not think that the Moon Jae-in government will allow Trump administration to strike North Korea unilaterally. If they would, if the United States would, that would be the end of that ROK-US alliance. That would be too costly. I don't think that rational minds would pursue that option. I think Mattis, Tillerson, and generals are not interested in opting this military solution. I'm not so sure about President Trump. As I said, it's very dangerous because he seems to believe in this unpredictability, giving him some leverage. I think that's a grave mistake, and it could have caused consequences. So I would not rule out any possibility of a military option of the Trump administration. But I cannot say when, how that the Trump administration would wage war.
Just one question. A preemptive strike by the United States on North Korea, that could also put Japan in danger, right? So in that case, how is it going to affect the US-Japan alliance?
I think it would also strain the US-Japan alliance almost irreparably. I do not think that Japanese government, whether it's under Abe or not, will accept that unilateral military strike on North Korea without being consulted. And when Japan would be consulted, I would say they would say no.
I had a
Hi.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. Just, quick response to that. I think obviously there needs to be negotiations with North Korea. We need to find a diplomatic solution to the issue. They are a nuclear armed state. I think this whole question about should we accept it or not accept it, I mean, they are. It's going to take more than just quick negotiations to get rid of their nuclear weapons. And for me, I think it's just, we might be able to solve it through negotiations in the way that we solved, we had an Iran deal, which was very positive. But it's just a temporary solution. There will always be countries wanting nuclear weapons as long as if we don't address the actual threat. So, and that brings me to the question about what will happen if someone actually uses nuclear weapons, which is really, I am convinced that also the nuclear armed states will prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. The question is, do we do it before or after they are used again? Because if they are used, and not only are the consequences going to be so obvious for everyone, we're going to be reminded that this is not theory. This is a real weapon with real people. The world looks very different than 1945. The impact on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were devastating, but imagine a city that is much more dense, that is built in a different way. I mean, the consequences would be so devastating that, I mean, it would change everything, of course. The question is, would it trigger a nuclear war with multiple exchanges, or will it be a one-off? It's difficult to imagine. And I think that there were comments about how we have to encourage the nuclear armed states to lead at this point. They need to sit down and start negotiate. And they're not going to do that just by themselves. We had 8 years of the most progressive American president on nuclear weapons, someone who came into power and sat for 8 years and had a vision and wanted to do something, and what happened? Not very much. We cannot just wait for them. We cannot just sit around and hope that leaders will do the right thing, because these countries, how reasonable they might be, might elect an unreasonable leader suddenly. And I think that's really why we need to mobilize countries around the nuclear weapon states to make it more politically costly to threaten to use weapons of mass destruction, to really put pressure on these countries. This issue is not going to be solved by leaders. it's going to solve it, the leaders are going to solve it when they feel forced to solve it. And we have to force them before the forcing power is the actual use of nuclear weapons.
So we have 5 minutes remaining, so I'd like to hear one last question from the lady and then hear from each of the speakers, closing remarks and the main takeaways from our discussions today.
Thank you. I'm Deb O'Hara-Ruskowski, and I'm a delegate at the United Nations, and I just have a few points to make. The ideal goal that we talk about of denuclearization, certainly altruistic, but unrealistic, as many of you have noted. Given Rex Tillerson's statement to the member states last few months ago, no negotiations will take place unless the states come to the table to really discuss denuclearization. So the stability or the lack thereof of North Korea's dictator can't be dealt with rationally. Now, you can talk about Trump's rhetoric, but he lets North Korea know he will act in response to him. And perhaps maybe the only way he will listen, not do as I say, or do as I say, not as I do. We've seen what happened in the last administration's strategy, which did not reduce anything, and was rather North Korea built up arsenal proliferation, increased testing, increased mileage, enough to point to New York and Washington. And coupled with the former Secretary of State uranium deal, basically gave Iran the ability to expand the nuclear arsenal. So I agree with the old weaponry statistics of weapons of mass destruction, and as a healthcare provider myself, I agree with the horrific results on humankind for decades. But what other deterrent? What else can we do in dealing with unstable leaders? And I'm not just talking about Trump.
We go this order and answer the question and also add your closing remarks. Minister?
That was a statement, not really a question, and of course, good enunciation of a viewpoint. If you have to take a takeaway from this, I would go back to say that if the process is to move forward, if the process is to be credible, if the process has to be step by step, then we must agree on 3 tangibles. 1, the process must be universal. Number 2, the process must be non-discriminatory. And number 3, the process must be verified. Thank you.
Yes, I think even though we should be focused on the ultimate goal of nuclear-free world, and I think we should maintain that goal. At the same time, we also have to address that current most urgent issues, particularly in East Asia, how to dismantle North Korea's nuclear capability and program. What has to be asked is that, are that sanctions enough? What sort of pressures will get through to Pyongyang? And, can the regional players let themselves be in a position of nuclear blackmail? That missile defense have been put in place, but North Korea's nuclear and missile programs continue to make progress, so that the defenses look, woefully unprepared. So we really have to address those urgent issues right now. That's the meaning of step-by-step solution. But eventually, I think we have to get North Korea to come back to the table. A military option is, I think, is not an option.
Yeah, I wouldn't call disarmament unrealistic or irrational. The fact is that the majority of states in the world are able to ensure their security and defend themselves without threatening to indiscriminately slaughter civilians with weapons of mass destruction. And it really means that we have a choice right now. We can choose to move towards disarmament and end nuclear weapons, or we keep them and they will be used. if you choose to keep them, they will be used. And who's the irrational one here, to be honest?
Thank you so much everyone, to the whole panel and to the audience.